Continuing the varieties of religious experience, a study in human nature by William James. We are in lecture 18, philosophy. If man were only a creature of transient sensations and impulses, of an ever coming and going succession of intuitions, fancies, feelings, then nothing could ever have for him the character of objective truth or reality, but it is the prerogative of man's spiritual nature that he can yield himself up to a thought and will that are infinitely larger than his own. As a thinking, self-conscious being, indeed, he may be said, by his very nature, to live in the atmosphere of the universal life. As a thinking being, it is possible for me to suppress and quell in my consciousness every movement of self-assertion, every notion and opinion that is merely mine, every desire that belongs to me as this particular self, and to become the pure medium of a thought that is universal. In one word, to live no more my own life, but let my consciousness be possessed and suffused by the infinite and eternal life of spirit. And yet it is just in this renunciation of self that I truly gain myself or realize the highest possibilities my own nature. But whilst in one sense we give up self to live in the universal and absolute self of reason, yet that to which we thus surrender ourselves is in reality our truer self. The life of the absolute reason is not a life that is foreign to us. Nevertheless, Principal Caird goes on to say, so far as we are able to outwardly realize this doctrine, the balm it offers remains incomplete. Whatever we may be in posse, the very best of us, in actu, falls very short of being absolutely divine. Social morality, love, and sacrifice even merge ourself only in some other finite self, ourselves. They do not quite identify it with the finite. Man's ideal destiny, infinite in abstract logic, might thus seem in practice forever unrealizable. Is there, then, our author continues, no solution of the contradiction between the ideal and the actual? We answer, there is such a solution, but in order to reach it, we are carried beyond the sphere of morality into that of religion. It may be said to be the essential characteristic of religion as contrasted with morality, that it changes aspiration into fruition, anticipation into realization, that instead of leaving man in the interminable pursuit of a vanishing ideal, it makes him the actual partaker of a divine or infinite life. Whether we view religion from the human side or the divine as the surrender of the soul to God, or as the life of God in the soul, in either aspect, it is of its very essence that the infinite has ceased to be a far-off vision and has become a present reality. The very first pulsation of the spiritual life, when we rightly apprehend its significance, is the indication that the division between the spirit and its object has vanished, that the ideal has become real, that the finite has reached its goal and become suffused with the presence and life of the infinite. Oneness of mind and will with the divine mind and will is not the future hope and aim of religion, but its very beginning and birth in the soul. To enter on the religious life is to terminate the struggle. In that act, which constitutes the beginning of the religious life, call it faith or trust or self-surrender, or by whatever name you will, there is involved in the identification of the finite with the life which is eternally realized. It is true indeed that the religious life is progressive, but understood in the light of foregoing idea, religious progress is not progress towards, but within the sphere of the infinite. It's not the vain attempt by endless finite additions or increments to become possessed of infinite wealth, but it is the endeavor by the constant exercise of spiritual activity to appropriate that infinite inheritance of which we are already in possession. The whole future of the religious life is given in its beginning, but it is given implicitly. The position of the man who has entered on the religious life is that evil, error, imperfection do not really belong to him. They are excrescences which have no organic relation to his true nature. They are already virtually as they will be actually suppressed and annulled, and in the very process of being annulled, they become the means of spiritual progress. Though he is not exempt from temptation and conflict, yet in that inner sphere in which his true life lies, the struggle is over, the victory is already achieved. It is not a finite, but an infinite life which the Spirit lives. Every pulse beat of his existence is the expression and realization of the life of God. John Caird, Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion, London and New York, 1880, pages 243 to 250 and 291 to 299, much abridged. You will readily admit that no description of the phenomena of the religious consciousness could be better than these words of your lamented preacher and philosopher. They reproduce the very rapture of those crises of conversion of which we have been hearing. They utter what the mystic felt but was unable to communicate, and the saint in hearing them recognizes his own experience. It is indeed gratifying to find the content of religion reported so unanimously, but when all is said and done, his principal Caird, and I only use him as an example of that whole mode of thinking, transcended the sphere of feeling and of the direct experience of the individual and laid the foundations of religion in impartial reason. Has he made religion universal by coercive reasoning, transformed it from a private faith into a public certainty? Has he rescued its affirmations from obscurity and mystery? I believe that he has done nothing of the kind, but that he has simply reaffirmed the individual's experiences in a more generalized vocabulary. And again, I can be excused from providing technically that the transcendentalist reasonings fail to make religion universal, for I can point to the plain fact that a majority of scholars, even religiously disposed ones, stubbornly refuse to treat them as convincing. The whole of Germany, one may say, has positively rejected the Hegelian argumentation. As for Scotland, I need only mention Professor Fraser's and Professor Pringle-Patterson's memorable criticisms with which so many of you are familiar. A.C. Fraser, The Philosophy of Theism, second edition, Edinburgh and London, 1899, especially Part 2, Chapters 7 and 8. A. Seth Pringle-Patterson, Hegelianism and Personality, 1880. 1890, David Passon. The most persuasive arguments in favor of the concrete individual soul of the world with which I am acquainted are those of my colleague, Josiah Royce, in his Religious Aspect of Philosophy, Boston, 1885, in his Conception of God, New York and London, 1897, and lately in his Aberdeen Gifford Lectures, The World and the Individual, 2 volumes, New York and London, 1901, 1902. I doubtless seem to some of my readers to evade the philosophic duty which my thesis in these lectures imposes upon me, by not even attempting to meet Professor Royce's arguments articulately. I admit the momentary evasion. In the present lectures, which are cast throughout in a popular mold, there seems no room for a subtle metaphysical decision, and for practical purposes it was sufficient. The contention of philosophy being what it is, namely, that religion can be transformed into a universally convincing science, to point to the fact that no religious philosophy has actually convinced the mass of thinkers. Meanwhile, let me say that I hope that the present volume may be followed by another, if I am spared to write it, in which not only Professor Royce's arguments, but only for monistic absolutism, shall be considered with all the technical fullness which their great importance calls for. At present, I resign myself to lying passive under the reproach of superficiality. Once more, I ask if transcendental idealism were as objectively and absolutely rational as it pretends to be, could it possibly fail so egregiously to be persuasive? What religion reports you must remember, always reports to be a fact of experience. The divine is actually present, religion says, and between it and ourselves, relations of give and take are actual. If definite perceptions of fact like this cannot stand upon their own feet, surely abstracting reason cannot give them the support they are in need of. Conceptual processes can class facts, define them, interpret them, but they do not produce them, nor can they reproduce their individuality. There is always a plus thisness which feeling alone can answer for. Philosophy in this sphere is thus a secondary function, unable to warrant faith's veracity, and so I revert to the thesis which I announced at the beginning of this lecture. In all sad sincerity, I think we must conclude that the attempt to demonstrate by purely intellectual processes the truth of the deliverance of direct religious experience is absolutely hopeless. It would be unfair to philosophy, however, to have her under this negative sentence. Let me close, then, by briefly enumerating what she can do for religion. If she will abandon metaphysics and deduction for criticism and induction, and frankly transform herself from theology into science of religions, she can make herself enormously useful. The spontaneous intellect of man always defines the divine which it feels in ways that harmonize with its temporary intellectual prepossessions. Philosophy can, by comparison, eliminate the local and the accidental from these definitions, both from dogma and from worship. She can remove historic incrustations. Well, depends on what you mean by that, but by confronting the spontaneous religious constructions with the results of natural science, philosophy can also eliminate doctrines that are now known to be scientifically absurd or incongruous. So I guess it's the people inventing myths and forming ethnocentric sort of ideas for a ethnicity that hasn't stayed the same or hasn't even stayed. Sifting out in this way unworthy formulations, she can leave a residuum of conceptions that at least are possible. With these she can deal as hypothesis, testing them in all the manners, whether negative or positive, by which hypotheses are ever tested. She can reduce their number, as some are found to be more open to objection. She can perhaps become the champion of one which she picks out as being the most closely verified or verifiable. She can refine upon the definition of this hypothesis, distinguishing between what is innocent over belief and symbolism in the expression of it, and what is likely to be literally taken. As a result, she can offer mediation between different believers and help to bring about consensus of opinion. She can do this the more successfully, the better she discriminates the common and essential from the individual and local elements of the religious beliefs which she compares. I do not see why a critical science of religions of this sort might not eventually command as general a public adhesion as is commanded by a physical science. Even the personally non-religious might accept its conclusions on trust, much as blind persons now accept the facts of optics. It might appear as foolish to refuse them, yet, as the science of optics has to be fed in the first instance, and continually verified later, by facts experienced by seeing persons, so the science of religions would depend for its original material on facts of personal experience, and would have to square itself with personal experience through all its critical reconstructions. It could never get away from concrete life or work in a conceptual vacuum. It would forever have to confess, as every science confesses, that the subtlety of nature lies beyond it, and that its formulas are but approximations. Philosophy lives in words, but truth and fact well up in our lives in ways that exceed verbal formulation. There is in the living act of perception always something that glimmers and twinkles and will not be caught, and for which reflection comes too late. No one knows this as well as the philosopher. He must fire his volley of new vocables out of his conceptual shotgun, for his profession condemns him to this industry, but he secretly knows the hollowness and irrelevancy. His formulas are like stereoscopic or kinetoscopic photographs seen outside the instrument. They lack the depth, the motion, the vitality. In the religious sphere in particular, belief that formulas are true can never wholly take the place of personal experience. In my next lecture, I will try to complete my rough description of religious experience, and in the lecture after that, which is the last one, I will try my own hand at formulating conceptually the truth to which it is a witness.